The ending of Jane Eyre is amazing. It is both an artistically and emotionally appropriate conclusion to the story, and it is a major contributing factor to why the book has stood the test of time with both critics and readers. Or at least, that's what I think. However, there are plenty of critics and readers who hate that ending. Indeed, a lot of people think that Jane Eyre's ending is a cop-out at best and ruins the book at worst. There's disagreement among scholars as to if Jane and Rochester end the novel as equal. Those who think they do are more likely to see the ending as a satisfying one, and those who don't are more likely to see the novel as a big wah-wah to what is otherwise a feminist masterpiece of Victorian literature. I myself am decidedly in team satisfying ending, as to my mind, it is a perfectly logical conclusion to both the plot structure Bronte establishes, as well as the character arcs baked into the journey we go on with Jane and Rochester. So in this video, I would like to argue why Jane Eyre's ending is so satisfying to me and so many others. But before we get into that, I also want to seize this opportunity of close reading a book in the English literary canon to make a detour into some literary theory talk and cover some topics I'm often asked about, i.e. death of the author versus authorial intent. But I'll be sure to leave timestamps below for those who want to jump straight into the Eyre talk. Massive spoiler warnings for literally the entire novel are officially in effect. Turn back now if you don't want to know anything about what happens in this novel if you have not yet read it. You ready? You sure? I am arguing for a reading of the ending of Jane Eyre that sees it as the natural climax to the story that Bronte was telling, not a slapped-on ending to fit the social conventions of the time. I am not arguing you have to like or agree with the way Bronte ends the story. At the end of the day, I firmly align myself with the settled law of the most esteemed fake judge on the internet, Judge John Hodgman. People like what they like. You cannot talk someone into liking something that they just don't like. And if you just don't like the ending of Jane Eyre for whatever reason, go with God. I do not hold it against you. Mostly. For whatever reason, stories like this, and Beauty and the Beast, and Phantom of the Opera speak to my id, but that is of course not true for everyone.
What's your bad feminist opinion? Mine is that I really like Mr. Rochester from Jane Eyre. I mean, I know that he keeps his wife in the attic. And that's like a real... It's a real shit thing to do. I know I should, but I love it. I like all of the little comments he makes towards Jane, that she looks like that she's a fairy and she's a witch and she's a fairy and she's an elf, but he means it in like a nice way because he's flirting with her, because he's like, you've bewitched me, but she doesn't quite get it. She's like, I'm not a fairy, I'm just Jane, and he's basically just like, I'm into you. But his wife's in the attic.
There's no intent on my part to lady-splain you into enjoying something that is just not for you. And finally, I've been watching a lot of watercolor YouTube recently and have found it a relaxing visual to enjoy during story times or commentary type videos, so I thought I would give that a go in this video. This is literally the first picture I've ever attempted to paint, so this is purely for vibes and not for skill. I am well aware that I am the most newbie of noobs. With all that being said, let's start with our detour into literary theory before we dive into a close reading of what is my personal all-time favorite book. Part 1. How we interpret the classics. So look, I'm going to be talking a lot about Charlotte Bronte in this video. That's because I'm arguing that there is an intentional structure that makes the ending of Jane Eyre so great that I believe must have been at least somewhat purposeful. That said, bringing up the author so much does raise a lovely argument we get into a lot on the bookish internet, which is how much is death of the author a thing, B, authorial intent versus modern audience impact, and C, does the historical contextualization that can be provided for classic literature outweigh the harm that these texts can cause? I want to detour into this area because it's something I'm asked about a lot, and I feel like I can't launch into a full-throated defense of the way this book ends without acknowledging the type of critical lens I'm bringing to bear, as well as allowing for my perspective to coexist with these other ways of looking at Jane Eyre. So let's start with death of the author. This is a postmodern literary theory that falls under the umbrella of post-structuralism critique that originates with the French theorist Roland Barthes. He famously said, "The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author." Lindsay Ellis describes the death of the author movement in a very accessible way, so I will let her do the talking.
French literary critic and theorist Roland Barthes published his essay, La mort de l'auteur, or The Death of the Author, which was published in English the following year. The simplest reduction of the essay's thesis is that readers should pull away from the tenet of traditional literary criticism that focused on authorial intent, and instead adopt a more text-oriented approach that focused on the interaction between the reader and the text, not between reader and the author. By the 1960s, academia now saw itself trending towards a post-structuralist point of view, fueled by thinkers like Foucault, Barthes, and my good friend Derrida. For the purposes of keeping this short and sweet, we'll keep our discussion of post-structuralism contained to where it concerns Barthes and novelists. In Death of the Author, Barthes argues that writing is that neutral, composite, oblique space where our subject slips away, the negative where all identity is lost, starting with the very identity of the body writing. In other words, Barthes argues that a piece of text is fundamentally divorced from the author who made it, and if it seems like a simple concept now, keep in mind, in particular to the literary and visual arts, up until the 1960s, much of a creator's work in academia was examined through a lens that tied together said creator and their life. Biography was king in helping to interpret or understand a work of art. Meaning, to Barthes, lies in the language of a text itself, and whatever impressions the reader creates from it. The author is less of a god and more of a mere scripter. And according to Barthes' contemporary Foucault, the work, which once had the duty of providing immortality, now possesses the right to kill, to be its author's murderer.
This theory lies on the far end of a spectrum that has been slowly developing over the last 100 years or so of the philosophy of literary criticism. Now, before I even attempt to break this down, let me acknowledge what anyone familiar with this landscape is going to be thinking. Mara, you are wrong about XYZ. And you're possibly right. In trying to review my previous notes from classes that cover this topic, as well as in doing some additional research of my own, I think I can comfortably say that part of the reason all of this area of theory is so confusing is that there is not firm consensus on which thinkers belong in what camps. The boundaries between a lot of these movements are still quite porous, and this is exacerbated by the fact that many of the players we're talking about evolved their thinking over time and migrated from one school to another. Jonathan Culler has a really nice introduction in On Deconstruction that validated that I wasn't just totally missing something in trying to schematize this area of theory. He particularly argues how fluidly the terms structuralism and post-structuralism have been applied over the years. With that being said, I am going to attempt to roughly schematize this spectrum of critical thought into 4 buckets that I know will not please everyone, but I think will be an approachable entry into understanding the kinds of conversation within literary criticism for the last 100 years or so. I'm calling them traditionalism, formalism, structuralism, and post-structuralism. Traditionalism is the broad term I'm going to use for the approach to literary interpretation used prior to the 20th century. In this interpretive mode, the job of the reader or critic is to discern the author's meaning in the text. The idea is that there is a set meaning or meanings that can be discerned by careful study of the author in the text, and things like the author's biography, historical milieu, and extant commentary from the author are the primary tools used to interpret their works with the goal of arriving at a single answer as to meaning. Formalism, or here in America, new criticism, emerged in the 20th century, and this is where we see the author and their meaning dethroned a little bit. Rather, the focus switched to the text itself. At least when I was growing up in the 90s and early aughts, this was the mode of criticism that dominated the way I was taught to approach literature. For example, the essay that I feel like half of us were required to write about the color symbolism in The Great Gatsby. In formalism, there is an attempt to make literary interpretation a more objective or scientific endeavor, and the emphasis is on close reading of the text itself, without giving undue thought to the writer of the text, nor to the reader of the text. Structuralism is sometimes conflated with formalism, but I want to call it out as its own movement, as it pivots away from the text itself as the locus of where meaning is made, and rather emphasizes the system that the text under consideration exists within. Think Joseph Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces as an example of this type of interpretive exercise. We don't interpret Hercules in isolation from the hundreds of other hero quest stories we have also consumed throughout our lifetimes, nor apart from what those hero journeys represent, present in their various cultural milieus. Meaning in structuralism comes from viewing the overall landscape that the text exists within. It also places an emphasis on different hermeneutical lenses to help bring out different meanings, such as the tools of sociology or psychology, or applying other theoretical schools such as Marxism or feminism to a text to better understand broader structures of its possible meanings. And finally, post-structuralism circles back to where we began, the death of the author and the rise of the reader. In post-structuralism, or deconstructive literary theory, it's not the author, nor the text itself, nor the system the text exists within that creates meaning. Meaning creation resides within the reader themselves as they interact with the text. I provide this context because I have observed that as a shorthand for this entire spectrum of possible approaches to literary interpretation, online bookish discourse has latched on to the mantra of death of the author in recent years, often as either a tactic for distancing authorial bad behaviors from a beloved text, for example, J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter. With that in mind, I do want to offer some overall comments on my perspective as to how I approach literary interpretation. I tend to agree with critics who argue that a strict death of the author strategy is somewhat non-coherent when the rubber meets the road. For example, would a theorist who really doesn't think the author, or scripter in Bardian parlance, is a key contributor to meaning-making in a text spend so much energy trying to communicate their own ideas clearly, or teaching others to do the same? I find that there's a level of cognitive dissonance present in a project that is truly about a scripter's inability to influence meaning in the reader, when the project itself is about persuading others your theory is correct, or at least communicating that theory in a way that others can understand your meaning. I become particularly skeptical of a complete death of the author approach for authors who are still alive. Lindsay Ellis summarizes my views well in her video essay.
In literary theory, paratext refers to material supplied by authors, editors, printers, and publishers. This concept has more recently expanded to anything relating to a text, ranging all the way from cultural context to personal brand, to size and nature of online platform, and, most importantly, to personal identity. It's not that trying to apply Barth's idea is invalid, but that given the way culture is trending and how the focus on personal brand and identity is only increasing, even an author that tries to let their work speak for itself can never really die. Foucault was actually way more hardcore than Barth was. Where Barth stuck to literary theory, Foucault saw the author as a bigger problem within a wider system of thought who got in the way of the discourse. But Foucault considered the decree that the author has disappeared to be an empty one without praxis, and stated that we must locate the space left empty by the author's disappearance, follow the distribution of gaps and breaches, and watch for openings this disappearance uncovers. In the year of our Lord 2018, we call that thing personal brand. 50 years later, the work does not possess the right to kill, to be its author's murderer, because the work will always be tied to the brand, and in that brand lies a certain sort of immortality. What is brand can never die. Foucault was a big proponent not only of shedding personal identity as it pertained to works, but all the trappings of identity. How one person of one gender or one race in one time and one place reads Macbeth will be read way differently than how someone else in completely different circumstances will read it. Same with who writes it. And this is a huge shortcoming of Death of the Author in general. It assumes that all people from all backgrounds have equal opportunity. They don't. And that all texts have equal opportunity for exposure based on the merit of the text. They don't. In a perfect world, Foucault would be right, and everyone would have equal opportunity and all texts would be judged on their own merit and not tied to either the author's identity or their body of work. But we don't live in a perfect world, Michel. Therefore, Foucault's ideas, and to a lesser extent Barth's, can really only exist in the world of pure theory, because who tells what story, what their background is, and why they are telling it matters to readers, and is only mattering more and more as time marches on.
With that being said, you may be surprised to hear that my best attempt at mapping my own approach onto these four schools puts me somewhere in the post-structuralist camp. There is a variant of post-structuralist thought that is hinted at in the very name Death of the Author, called reader response theory. Reader response theory comes in a variety of nuances, but what I like about its approach is that yes, it does start with the reader as the primary meaning maker within the text. However, depending on what version you follow, this theory gives space for readers to use the tools and strategies of the other three camps to assist them in their meaning making. For me, as I said up top, I do ultimately defer to readers' own experiences with a text, what it means to them, if they do or don't enjoy it, etc. That said, I personally find myself relying on strategies like close reading, different theoretical structures like feminism, and especially for classics, the historical context that a text was written in to help me understand how a text is working with me to create meaning and why it might have been written in the way that it was. This doesn't fit neatly into any one box, but it's the closest thing I have as an answer to how I approach interpreting literature. I have left out a whole chunk of philosophy surrounding epistemology and semiotics that we would have to explore for a robust discussion of this topic, but I think that's enough to give you a sense of why I will employ various biographical, historical, genre structure, and close reading strategies in making my case for the ending of Jane Eyre being brilliant. Before we dive into that, I do want to take this opportunity to discuss two related topics that get raised when I talk about classics on this channel with some frequency. First, let's touch on the ongoing debate among those who read classics of authorial intent versus modern audience impact. What I mean by this is that there's often a divide between readers who, in their most extreme forms, either have no room to see anything in a classic work as being quote-unquote problematic for readers of today, and may take it upon themselves to mock anyone who raises objections to content present in canonical works, or who have no room to see anything in a classic work as being redeeming for readers of today, and may take it upon themselves to accuse anyone who does enjoy these works as being complicit in those works' harm. There are few people who fall on the very far ends of this divide, but they do exist. To illustrate the kinds of elements that are often present in the classics that today's readers must contend with, let's take a look at two such elements in Jane Eyre. First, there are the underlying elements of racism and colonialism present throughout the novel in both its plot and in its motifs. Wide Sargasso Sea addresses many of the plot elements in question, so I will simply commend those curious about Bertha Mason and her racial identity to that particular reading, as it is an excellent book in its own right. I will instead focus on a less notorious example, the pervasive imagery of slavery, and particularly harems that Rochester uses to describe how he conceptualizes his relationship with Jane. This language is a form of Orientalism in the 19th century, which Lindsay Ellis nicely summarizes in a different video. Yes, if you can't tell, I find her work really thought-provoking.
Let us go back to the mid-19th century when travel writing was all the rage, and there was particular interest in the Orient. It is from male European travelers to the Ottoman Empire that Europe was introduced to the idea of the harem, but only the idea, because men weren't allowed into harems, see? That's kind of the whole point. Only women and male relatives are allowed into harems. Them's the rules. And of course, our 19th century Eurotrash did not like that. Why can I not have the thing? And with this desire to be included in a space in which they were not allowed, their presumptions about the culture they were visiting combined with this forbidden space made their imaginations run wild. If we aren't allowed in there, it must be because it's sexy, licentious. It must be full of these sexy slave babes who don't really want it, but also kinda want it. These are some early mainstream European examples of what Columbia University professor of literature Edward Said defined as Orientalism in his 1978 book, Orientalism. The rise of what we'll call Orientalist media really begins in the 18th century, as major European world powers go into war with the Ottoman Empire. But where 19th century Orientalism really took off in the visual and language arts coincided with Napoleon's failed attempts to invade Syria and Egypt, and the British Empire's efforts to destabilize the Ottoman Empire at the beginning of the 19th century. As both world powers sought to colonize these areas, demand back home created an explosion of arts centered around the Middle East and Central Asia, often by artists who had never actually been to said territories, but, you know, they had like a friend who knew someone whose cousin had done like one of those Nile cruises. And as a result, we got art that looked something like this. But for your average Jack and Jacques back in Mother's England and France, this emerging visual culture dominated perceptions of these countries. No, paintings like this were not based in reality, yikes, but Victorian Europeans thought that they were. But the damage was done, and to this day when you hear the word harem in the Occident, it conjures up a very specific, very 19th century image. sexualized, licentious, appropriative, and above all, inaccurate.
Yikes on bikes. These motifs in Jane Eyre are likely meant to express Rochester's passion in quote-unquote exotic, heightened language, but that imagery has a sinister undertone in the text to Jane for the readers of the book at its release, and even more so to readers today. While it might be an effective device to make readers uncomfortable with the lovers' relationship during their engagement, it is also at the expense of using well-worn racist tropes associated with the Middle East. A second example is the characterization of Bertha Mason's mental illness. Bertha is presented with very little sympathy, even taking at face value Rochester's assertions about her mental health. Very likely, Charlotte Bronte drew inspiration for this portrayal from her experience with her brother Branwell, who came to live in the family home with his sisters and father once his substance addiction no longer allowed him to live independently. Indeed, the famous bed-burning scene in Rochester's room is drawn from a very similar incident that actually happened between Branwell and his father. So, we know that Charlotte's intention in Bertha's portrayal was likely some level of what she thought of as realism, but does that mitigate the impact that someone with actual acute mental illness might experience from this characterization? It's difficult to say, but these are questions that I think must be asked when assessing works with wide readership and enduring prestige. Where do I fall on these matters? I will refer back to how I opened this video. People like what they like. I honestly see room for most works that have entered the canon to be critiqued for their of its timeness in a way that would lead someone to still enjoy that work or lead to someone not liking the book at all. Using my own experiences as an example here, I think of certain classics that contain overt forms of sexism or misogyny. There are some of these books that will make me wrinkle my nose when I hit those portions, but otherwise I can still fully enjoy the work as a whole. There are others where those elements do impact my experience and make me ambivalent to the book when I reflect on my experience of reading it. And there are still others where those elements totally spoil any pleasure I could take from the work. All of these are valid responses, and I want to leave space for the same quote-unquote problematic elements to impact different readers differently, even, and perhaps especially, within the marginalized groups for whom those elements have the greatest potential to harm. I will say I have little patience for a certain thread of this debate where ardent defenders of a certain work sneer at people who do not enjoy elements of the book in question because they see that response as being too emotional or too subjective and therefore not a valid response. This supposes that emotional objectivity is both possible and desirable, of which I am not convinced. I personally see my job as a reader and promoter of works in the literary canon as leaving room for a variety of responses to a text, articulating what does or does not work for me in a given book, and providing historical context where I can to help myself and others think through why certain elements in a book may have been present in that time and place. And to start to wrap this detour up, to that end, as someone who talks a lot about historical context when it comes to the classics, do I think that contextualizing classic literature in its historical milieu always mitigates the harm those texts cause? For me, I'd say no. This is a case-by-case situation. There are some texts where it seems to me that the possible hurtful or harmful impact they could cause outweighs any value it has as a widely consumed historical document. That said, I think some books are still valuable for consumption today primarily as social artifacts of history. This is part of why I would advocate that much of what's on the English or literature curriculums in schools would actually be better fits for a history class, where the books in question would be discussed as social objects of their time and contextualized accordingly. Something like Uncle Tom's Cabin would seem to me to be a good candidate for that kind of move. Take those 2 cents for what they are worth, which is likely not very much, but as I am often asked about this, I thought this would be a good opportunity to put my own opinion out there. Part 2. Jane Eyre as a romance. But with all that being said, now that I have set the table in terms of how different critical theories can impact how we read classic literature, I'm ready to actually make the case for why I think Jane Eyre's ending is not an unfortunate slapdash addendum meant to appease the social conventions of the time. It's actually a narratively satisfying ending on two levels. First, its structure makes the most sense when mapped onto the beats of the popular romance genre that it helped to create. And second, its character arcs make most sense when viewed as a sort of allegorization of the Augustinian pull between duty and passion, and how those forces must be reconciled. Yeah, okay, don't worry, we'll dig into that last one in a little bit. First, a quick refresher of the plot of Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is an orphan who grows up being mistreated by almost everyone in her life, first by her extended family, and then by the administrators of an abusive boarding school she attends. Nevertheless, she emerges as a strong-minded woman of meager means and takes a post as a governess for the wealthy Mr. Rochester's ward. Jane and Rochester have instant chemistry, and after a lot of back and forth and angst, Rochester proposes to Jane despite their different stations in life. Thornfield, Rochester's house, is host to a number of ooky spooky goings-on throughout the courtship, which only intensify after the engagement. On their wedding day, it is revealed that Rochester already has a mentally ill wife named Bertha, who he keeps in the attic of Thornfield under the care of a nurse. Rochester begs Jane to become his mistress and move with him to France, the land of exiled Brits gone wild, but she refuses and flees. Through divine intervention, she ends up in the home of previously unknown cousins, including her dour male cousin, St. John Rivers. St. John is in love with another woman, but he wants to become a missionary to India and tries to persuade Jane to become his wife because he thinks she would be suited to that work. Jane refuses and eventually gets an inheritance that will allow her to live independently. She returns to Thornfield only to find it burned down and learns that Bertha perished in a fire that she set to the house. Rochester attempted to save her and not only failed, but also lost his sight and one of his hands in the process. Jane is reunited with Rochester at his small country estate, where they eventually marry and live happily ever after. The criticism of this ending is usually something to the effect that either a true happy ending for Jane would have been to have her end up alone, free of both men's influences, or that it is an artistic failure to require that Rochester be crippled in some way in order for Jane to be with him. In both critiques, the feeling is generally that Bronte was kowtowing to social conventions of her time, which dictated that a woman must be married in order to be happy, as well as the sense that Rochester is not an equal partner for Jane by the end of their story. This cop-out is also seen as undermining what is otherwise a remarkably feminist text for the period. These are the critiques that I am seeking to address with this analysis of why I think the book's ending is in no way one only added to appease the social pressures of Bronte's time. Let us begin our exploration with a structural analysis mapping Jane Eyre's place within the popular romance genre as a whole. Outside of genre studies, Jane Eyre is rarely conceptualized as a popular romance. Its unquestioned literary achievement makes critics reluctant to classify it as genre fiction, or if it is, they believe its genre elements diminish its overall literary achievement. However, like we talked about in my Historical Accuracy is Garbage and Here's Why video, a genre's formulaic limitations do not necessitate low aesthetics. As John Cowelty describes, a formula is a combination or synthesis of a number of specific cultural conventions with a more universal story form. While standardization is not highly valued in modern artistic ideologies, it is, in an important way, the essence of all literature. Standard conventions establish a common ground between writers and audiences. These conventions exist in every novel, though some novels have less recognizable formulas than those found in genre fiction. As our pal Thomas Roberts argues, junk fiction is as form-intensive as a sonnet or a villanelle. It is read in part for the formal pleasures it provides. Identifying a novel's formulaic basis and understanding its aesthetic ambitions are foundational components of much literary analysis. Like we talked about in the Historical Accuracy video, Roberts outlines a schema by which fiction's aesthetics can be assessed relative to the underlying genre formulas. For Roberts, most genre fiction, including popular romance, qualifies as junk fiction, or fiction that readers consume as a unit within a genre rather than reading the individual work for its own merits. Northrop Frye agrees, explaining that readers of genre fiction read within the entire convention rather than reading individual stories. Predictability is key to junk fiction, or, in the words of Kay Mussel, readers know that everything will work out according to a predictable value system, and that the vicarious pleasure can be repeated by picking up another book of the same type. Beyond junk fiction, Roberts goes on to describe the range of genre fiction quality within this schema. Jane Eyre is a rare work of popular genre fiction that has also achieved canonical status. We can also look to Barthes for these kinds of quality distinctions. In SZ, he talks about readerly text or replete literature that encourage readers to passively accept the most surface-level meaning. Barthes argues that these texts are controlled by the principle of non-contradiction that do nothing to challenge the pre-existing sensibilities that a reader has absorbed from their surrounding culture. This contrasts to writerly texts, which aspire to a more transcendent form of art that challenges the reader to be no longer a consumer, but a producer of the text. These texts call the reader to be a producer of the text's meaning, rather than accepting a pre-made meaning from the text or the author. All that to say, Jane Eyre is not only a canonical book in a genre that is perceived as being largely junk fiction, it is also a writerly text in a genre that is comprised primarily of readerly texts, as most popular genres are. Genres exist to help guide readers' expectations and interpretation. For books that function only as junk fiction or readerly texts, readers consume the novel for specific fictional fantasy conventions, or tropes. Depending on the reader's tastes and psychology, different formulas and tropes are more appealing. In popular romances, the triumph of romantic love over obstacles resulting in a happy ending constitutes the key fantasy. This necessarily places limits on the novel that operate within popular romance fantasies. As Laura Vivanco explains, even though there are romances which strive to be realistic, the constraints of the form ensure that they cannot depict the full range of possible realistic outcomes for their protagonists. Thus, although an individual romance may be deemed relatively realistic, a collection of such novels will tend to see less so. But remember, from our last discussion about historical accuracy, realism is not intrinsically a superior aim for a work of art. There's a cultural bias towards seeing realism as a higher form of aesthetic achievement, but please don't hear me pointing out that a lack of realism in most genre romance as a diminution of its value. I raise all of this to point out that Jane Eyre's ending with a happily ever after may not be the gritty realism turn that some readers might prefer in the novel, but it is an appropriate and necessary ending for a popular romance. With that understanding of genre established, there are two primary narrative techniques to support these popular romance fantasies, both of which are present in Jane Eyre: a formulaic mode and a formulaic plot framework. Our buddy Fry's literary taxonomy helps in defining this formulaic mode, and Vivanco argues that the genre primarily operates in what Fry describes as the high mimetic mode. This mode, with its abnormally superior protagonist and improbable events set in a recognizable world, allows a level of naturalism in the popular romance that aids reader immersion in the fictive universe while still maintaining the crucial fantasy, which provides readers with escapist satisfaction. For example, remember the super flowery language we stereotypically associate with popular romance? The turgid rods and the glistening caves? This over-the-top language that was a hallmark to foundational texts in the genre is a key component of its high mimetic mode. As Jane Ann Krentz argues, this language was a code between author and reader to indicate which fantasies and tropes the author was employing. That genre-specific language created and reinforced popular romance's mode and conventions. In addition to the formulaic mode, the popular romance genre has key plot frameworks that structure its fantasies. The Romance Writers of America broadly defines this plot framework as a central love story with an emotionally satisfying and optimistic ending, in which the lovers who risk and struggle for each other and their relationship are rewarded with emotional justice and unconditional love. Within this broader structure, Pamela Regis argues that there are 8 key narrative elements that are found in popular romance: a definition of society always corrupt that the romance novel will reform, the meeting between the heroine and the hero, an account of their attraction for each other, the barrier between them, the point of ritual death, the recognition that fells the barrier, the declaration of the heroine and the hero that they love each other, and their betrothal. These elements may be repeated in the narrative and appear in different order, but they must all be present. Jane Eyre qualifies as popular romance because it employs both the genre's formulaic mode and formulaic plot structure. It's also fair to characterize it as popular fiction given its commercial success in its time. Indeed, as most major studies observe, Jane Eyre is one of the 3 main works that shaped the popular romance genre as we know it today. Along with Samuel Richardson Richardson's Pamela and Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, Jane Eyre defined many key features of the genre, though Jane Eyre particularly influenced Gothic popular romance, which subsequently led to category romance, romantic suspense, erotic romance, and paranormal romance. Its plot, characters, and tone profoundly shaped the overall genre's development. Sidebar: it should be noted that Jane Eyre also has a lot of continuity with the Gothic tradition, as well as governess novels. Anne Radcliffe's oeuvre was particularly influential on Jane Eyre. However, what makes Jane Eyre key to the popular romance genre's development is its synthesis of those existing literary traditions into the emerging popular romance formulaic mode and plot structure, which are not features of earlier Gothic works. In addition to establishing trope conventions, Jane Eyre defined the high mimetic mode that allows the popular romance genre to balance its need for fantastical and naturalistic elements. Though the setting and characters contain naturalistic elements that create verisimilitude for the reader, the interjections of the supernatural and improbable plot twists keep the novel firmly within the realm of fantasy. Musil argues that this balance is achieved through Jane's complex interior life and Bronte's skill in writing first-person narration, but regardless of how the text pulls this off, in Jane Eyre, Bronte succeeded in creating a romantic fantasy set in a naturalistic world, bridging the divide between legend and realistic fiction, and creating the enduring legacy of romance novels as the preeminent Bildungsroman for women. With all this being said, critics of Jane Eyre rarely conceptualize the novel as a popular romance, likely because its quality and innovation have allowed it to transcend genre prejudices and achieve canonical status. However, this interpretive lens is a key counter-argument to critics who see Jane Eyre's narrative as disjointed in two areas. First, these critics see the novel's beginning as overlong and irrelevant to the central conflict, and they attribute this weakness to the novel's over-reliance on Bronte's own biography. Second, and more importantly to my overall argument, they argue that the novel's ending is imbalanced, abrupt, or tonally out of step with the narrative. Reading the novel in the context of Bronte's spiritual beliefs, which we will come back to in a bit, and as a popular romance novel addresses these critiques. By mapping the novel's plot into Regis's schema, it becomes clear that the narrative does have a unified plot within romance genre conventions. The extended account of Jane's childhood, which critics say undermines the narrative's unity, constitutes the book's definition of the unjust society that Jane inhabits. Through abusive social environments, Jane Eyre defines a society that seeks to restrict Jane's freedom and deems her unlovable. Thus, Jane's happy ending must include a social environment that promotes her free spirit and validates her worthiness of love. The novel then recounts 3 cycles of what Regis describes as meeting to betrothal. These cycles structure Jane Eyre's key narrative conflict. The first cycle with Rochester's courtship of Jane, the second cycle with St. John River's courtship of Jane, and the third cycle with an independent Jane courting the redeemed Rochester. The first cycle is doomed to failure because Rochester's lies and Jane's idolatrous love of him prevent Jane from identifying the true barrier to their union. On the surface, the barrier in this cycle is the difference in their class stations and Rochester's ostensible entanglement with Blanche Ingram. However, the hidden barrier is actually Rochester's existing marriage to Bertha Mason. After their engagement, Jane's dependent financial position emerges as another barrier that is not overcome until the third cycle. Upon realizing that Rochester is already married, Jane's self-imposed exile results from her comprehension of the true barrier between them. The second cycle is doomed because St. John's inability to love is ultimately an insuperable barrier. St. John's fixation on Jane grows through her time with his family. However, his attraction is to her utility as a missionary's wife, not to Jane herself. Jane is likewise attracted to St. John as a good man, rather than to him for himself or as a lover. The barrier is the lack of true love between the pair, as well as their pre-existing love for other partners. St. John attempts to ignore the barrier and proposes, resulting in a divine intervention that prevents Jane from succumbing to the ill-advised match. The third cycle succeeds because the true barriers between Jane and Rochester, 1, Rochester's first wife, and 2, Jane's financial dependence, are finally overcome. The point of ritual is reached in Thornfield's fire. The barriers fade as Bertha perishes in the fire, and Jane inherits enough money to become independently wealthy. This leaves Jane free to seek Rochester out, and he renews his proposal once Jane makes her feelings known. The third cycle ends in the marriage of the equally matched couple, as it is Jane who initiates the courtship, and Jane who has regained her agency in their relationship. Note that the famous line in the ending is, "Reader, I married him," not "Reader, he married me." Through its narrative, repetition, and aborted courtship cycles, Jane Eyre uses romance plot structures to underscore deeper thematic content, highlighting the romance formula's flexibility. The plot's frequent improbability is made credible to the reader through the naturalistic setting and narration, such as the narrative conceit of the hidden mad wife in the attic. Thus, though Jane Eyre may have an unconventional structure when measured against more realist novels, by viewing it as a popular romance, the fantastical and naturalistic elements of Jane Eyre's plot balance each other in a manner that is typical of its formula. The romance plot structure resolves seeming disunities. Part 3. Jane Eyre's character arcs. But to the other criticism often leveled at the novel's conclusion, is it fair to say that Jane and Rochester end the novel as an equally matched couple? I submit that they do, and that the book's deliberation in bringing about this equality undermines critiques of the ending as being disjointed or tragic. To explore this, it's time to come back to the second point I raised earlier. In the same way that Jane Eyre is seldom interpreted as a work of genre fiction, neither is it frequently thought of as a book nourished by spiritual themes or theological concerns. However, reading Jane Eyre through that lens reveals the internal cohesion of the narrative's conclusion in terms of the lover's character development. The general lack of engagement with the book's religious themes is somewhat strange given Bronte's background. Born to an Anglican curate, Bronte demonstrated active interest in faith matters throughout her life, and her religious ideology underpins her entire oeuvre. However, Tom Winifrith notes it is not obvious how her original mind reacted to the variety of religious beliefs which she encountered. It is therefore not unduly surprising that discussions of Bronte's religion have been few and unsatisfactory. Felicia Gordon notes that one cannot overestimate the influence of religion in Bronte's oeuvre, but the difficulty lies in identifying exactly what her complex and even shifting religious positions were. Basically, the reason this avenue of textual analysis is underexplored is because characterizing Bronte's beliefs is not a straightforward task. Each Bronte family member had a complex relationship with the multifaceted landscape of Christianity in early Victorian England. Charlotte's father, Patrick, was a thoroughgoing evangelical clergyman who had ties to William Wilberforce, Henry Martyn, and Charles Simeon at various points in his life. This commitment to evangelical ideals was typical in the early 19th century, as evangelicalism was the Anglican Church's dominant mode. And sidebar, I should mention here, folks, that evangelicalism has a lot of nuance in how it is expressed in different countries and time periods from the Enlightenment onwards. Today, we tend to associate that mode of Christianity with the flavor specific to American fundamentalist religion, but that really only came to be in the last 100 years or so don't picture today's Southern Baptists when I mention evangelicalism in this context. Probably this could be a whole other video. Anyways, back to Patrick Bronte. Patrick actually fell on the more broad-minded end of the evangelical spectrum, and Marianne Thormelin, who will be the patron saint of this video, argues that he instilled a deep dedication to freedom of conscience and a kind of ecumenism, or unity among different Christian churches and denominations, in his children. Charlotte displayed a varied set of beliefs on the spectrum of Christianity. In some respects, she was perfectly typical of early 19th century Anglican piety. For example, her faith tended to emphasize God's love rather than God's holiness. Taking its cue from Romanticism and evangelicalism, the mainstream Christianity of Bronte's England placed a heavy emphasis on divine love and comfort. This premium on religion of the heart is evident in Jane's character, as her integrity is linked throughout the novel with her free spirit and her fidelity to her heart's dictates. For Jane and her God, the twin pillars of Christianity are God's love expressed through the affections between people, and God's goodness expressed through one's conscience. In other respects, however, Bronte's religious convictions were unconventional for her time period, which actually has led to charges of anti-Christian ideology in her own day and in modern criticism. Indeed, some critics saw, and still see today, Jane Eyre as an attack on Christianity. However, reading Jane Eyre as anti-Christian rests on three fallacious presuppositions. First, these critics equate Bronte's willingness to satirize or criticize clergy with antagonism towards Christianity itself. Actually, Bronte's willingness to criticize is indicative of her affectionate familiarity with her religious beliefs and milieu. As she wrote, "I love the Church of England. Her ministers, indeed, I do not regard as infallible personages. But to the establishments with all her faults, I am sincerely attached." Second, this position does not allow for any doubt in someone's spiritual life. As most folks who have been a part of a religious belief system can attest, doubt is a normal part of many people's faith journey. Third, and to my mind, most tellingly, many of these critics assume that other ideological commitments evident in the text, particularly feminism, are somehow incompatible with small o Orthodox Christian belief. While this may be true for some adherents of that faith, it is certainly not true for all, and to preclude a sincere Christian faith and early feminist expression, especially in Charlotte's cultural milieu, is ahistorical at best. Bronte herself defended against these attacks in Jane Eyre's second edition, declaring, "Conventionality is not morality. Self-righteousness is not religion. To pluck the mask from the Pharisee is not to lift an impious hand to the crown of thorns." In other words, to call out what she saw as religious hypocrisy from religious officials did not, in her view, mean that she was denigrating the person of Jesus or what she believed about him. Indeed, a close reading of the text in light of Christian philosophy supports the book's plotline and characterization as conforming to basic tenets of the Christian faith. That being said, it must be acknowledged that Bronte did not uniformly adhere to the mainstream theology of her day, which does muddy the waters when parsing out the religious underpinnings of the text. Her beliefs, though, were still well within her contemporaries' boundaries of orthodoxy. Thormelin argues that Bronte leaned further towards the Christian universalism characterized by theologians such as Samuel Coleridge, yes, that Coleridge, F.D. Morris, and A.J. Scott than did her more conventionally evangelical father. Indeed, she was as influenced by Coleridge and his theological successors as she was by evangelicalism. For example, her soteriology was far more influenced by liberal theologians than by evangelicalism. She disagreed vehemently with Calvinistic interpretations of predestination and election. It is no surprise that the two clergymen who serve as Jane's antagonists are driven by Calvinist doctrines. Bronte's antagonism towards both Calvinism and Catholicism stemmed from her deep commitment to freedom, which she believed both ideologies undermine. I should note that mapping Bronte's antipathy towards Catholicism is a complex task, but Villette provides the most material for those who are interested in diving in further. Rather than predestination, Thormelin notes the importance of John 8:32 to Bronte's beliefs. "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." This commitment to freedom carried into her soteriology, which, by the way, means her doctrine of salvation. She believed that Jesus' death opened salvation's door for everyone. This more liberal thread in Bronte's belief does not sufficiently support reading Jane Eyre as anti-Christian, though. Rather, the evidence of an imagination profoundly shaped by Christian theology and scripture is evident on nearly every page. This would also not be out of keeping with genre conventions that Bronte may have been playing with, for as J. Dixon notes, the domestic novel of manners can be divided into three subgenres: governess novels, the prime example of which is Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre; social problem novels, the best example being Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South; and religious novels. These religion-based romances all ended to today's mind unhappily with the hero dying, but at the time the emphasis was on the struggle between faith and doubt, and when the hero dies as a Christian, it is seen in the novel as a triumph, not a defeat. With that in mind, let's dig into the character arcs of both Jane and Rochester, which I think are marked by each character's development of personal integrity and repentance. Jane's journey of faith begins with her conversion through Helen Burns, and then Rochester and St. John test her confidence in God's goodness and God's love in turn. While Rochester tempts Jane to betray her conscience, St. John tempts Jane to betray her affections, and it is only when Jane resists both temptations that she emerges as a mature self. Concurrently, Rochester experiences a more traditional redemption arc, where he moves from supreme belief in his own reason to faith in God's reason over his. All this to say, a theological interpretation serves as another counterpoint against those who see the narrative as disjointed. The novel's beginning serves to show Jane's conversion, and the story's ending illustrates Rochester's redemption. And both these components are essential to fulfill the popular romance dictates of a happy ending within Jane Eyre's moral universe, rather than in the traditional domestic religious novels' ideas of a happy ending. So, let's start with Jane's conversion. Her theology derives from spiritual mentor Helen Burns. This young girl who dies from the neglect of a brutal Calvinist schoolmaster provides the foundation for Jane's understanding of God's love. Helen's beliefs give her complete confidence in God's provision as she affirms, "I believe God is good, God is my Father, God is my friend, I love Him, I believe He loves me." She also exhorts Jane to stay true to the integrity of her God-given conscience, assuring her, "If all the world hated you and believed you wicked while your own conscience approved you and absolved you from guilt, you would not be without friends." This simple faith provides Helen comfort, profoundly shaping Jane's faith, though, for you philosophy nerds out there, Edward Mendelsohn rightly points out that Helen's faith is focused on a Neoplatonic unity that Jane explicitly rejects. However, Jane does take what she learns from Helen and reconfigures it into an atonement doctrine that emphasizes the equality of souls. From this point on, Jane's actions flow out of belief in God's love for His creatures and the importance of a divinely given conscience to guide one's actions. For Jane, love and conscience are the most direct experiences that someone has with God, and a betrayal of either of these things constitutes a violation of both self and faith. Helen's example for Jane serves as her first spiritual turning point. She turns away from allowing her passions free rein in the face of injustice. Helen's encouragement helps Jane tame the potentially destructive components of her passionate nature that are hinted at throughout her childhood. Rather than wholly embracing her passions, Jane accepts that her nature must be brought under the control of both love and conscience. As she seeks to bring her passions under the control of both forces over the course of the story, Jane must first resist the temptations of idolatry and moral indulgence, and then the temptation of loveless duty. In her struggle to abide by her conscience, Jane's greatest tool is her hard self-knowledge, guided by divine will. Notions of selfhood in Christian philosophy, starting with St. Paul and Augustine, are instructive in understanding why will and self-knowledge are critical to Jane's conception of her own integrity. As Larry Siedentop notes, the revolution of the self as a development from earlier Greco-Roman philosophy began with Paul's synthesis of those influences with Jewish and Christian philosophy. In Pauline philosophy, human agency acquires new independence through the promise that humans have access to the deepest reality as individuals rather than merely as members of a group. Augustine took Paul's understanding of the self and pushed it further. For Augustine, the will is the key to selfhood for two reasons. First, by synthesizing Pauline Christianity with Platonism's dualistic view of reason and desire, Augustine's anthropology centers on the idea that true selfhood is found in the authority of the will over both reason and desire. What is Platonism? Well, that's beyond the scope of this video, but the main thrust you need to know is that Platonism is often characterized as dualistic, where the activities of the mind, i.e. reason, are superior to the activities of the physical, i.e. desire, because it's only through reason that the ideal forms can be perceived. So with that in mind, what Augustine believed is that reason, the mind, and desire, the physical, are both crucial components of the self, but they are only good when they are both mediated by the will. Whether or not this stated belief plays out consistently in Augustine's work is a matter for another day, as there is a strong argument to be made that the lingering dualism in Augustine's work has strongly influenced Western Christian philosophy, but for our purposes, let's acknowledge that Augustine consistently argues for both mental and physical components of the self to work together under the will. The other thing Augustine believed is that an individual will is not only granted by God, but must ultimately be subjected to God's will to achieve full selfhood. As Charles Taylor observed, a key Augustinian contribution to Christian philosophy's conceptualization of the self is that one must go inwards to go upwards. In other words, Christians believe that it is in communing with God in the inward parts of your heart that you are able to ascend to higher purposes. In this understanding, you grow in spiritual insight and love of God as you better understand your own interiority and soul. The pursuit of self-knowledge is in the context of a will subjugated to divine will, and as self-knowledge increases, love and experience of God is also supposed to increase. In the Enlightenment period right before Charlotte Bronte, the Romantic philosophers particularly emphasized self-knowledge as a path to spiritual knowledge. Alison Cyril notes, the importance of an imagination open to the direction of the spirit in order to facilitate a true and free exercise of religion is a key theme both in Bronte's work and in her contemporaries. Jane's journey, then, is not only one of romantic love, but one in search of the true integrated self, trusting in self-knowledge to achieve greater spiritual insight. Torn between pure desire represented by Rochester and pure reason represented by St. John, Jane prevails only when she navigates these two aspects of the self with her will subjugated to the divine will. Jane's happy ending comes not simply when she is reunited with Rochester. Jane's happy ending comes when she has faced the temptations of both extremes of her nature and has triumphed over both. Jane asserts, feeling without judgment is a washy draught indeed, but judgment untempered by feeling is too bitter and husky a morsel for human deglution. Deglution is my new favorite word, by the way. Having overcome both extremes, she is rewarded with financial stability and marital felicity with an equal partner who has repented of his own misguided reason. The importance of Jane's self-knowledge and conscience becomes increasingly apparent once she is betrothed to Rochester. Even when she doesn't have concrete evidence of Rochester's deceit, Jane's intuition subtly warns her of impending disaster. When Rochester first declares that he wants to marry him, she doesn't even believe him. He asks, "Do you doubt me, Jane?" "Entirely. You have no faith in me?" "Not a whit." After the engagement, she still senses that her situation is untenable. She turns white when Rochester pronounces her Jane Rochester and tells him, "Human beings never enjoy complete happiness in this world. I was not born to a different destiny than the rest of my species. To imagine such a lot befalling me is a fairy tale, a daydream." Jane's judgment is proved correct again as her dreams of Thornfield's ruin and her separation from Rochester betrays the coming future. Even when Rochester tries to undermine her judgment by pretending that her veil's destruction was just a dream, Jane resolutely maintains that she saw it. Jane further demonstrates her fidelity to her own conscience by her resistance to Rochester's offers to mold her into his ideal. She spurns his offers of family heirlooms and jewels, as well as his gifts of lavish clothing. She will not eat dinner with him, continues in her governess role, and discourages his love songs. Still, she doesn't sufficiently trust her own misgivings about their relationship. "My future husband stood between me and every thought of religion. As an eclipse intervenes between man and the broad sun, I could not in those days see God for his creature of whom I had made an idol." As Cyril notes, Bronte shared this understanding of idolatry as a false prioritizing of desire within the heart, which was common among evangelicals of Victorian Britain. In retrospect, Jane is able to see that though she tried to maintain her own self apart from Rochester, she did not see him as he truly was. This is her great failing in the novel. By ignoring her own intuition, the foundational lie of their relationship warped her love for Rochester. She recognizes this failing as soon as Rochester's marriage to Bertha is revealed. "Oh, how blind had been my eyes, how weak my conduct, my eyes were covered and closed." Once Jane learns of Rochester's lies, she suffers the desolation not only of thwarted romantic love, but thwarted spiritual love. In this desolation, Jane feels utterly cut off from God, noting her inability to pray. The novel's second volume ends at her spiritual journey's darkest moment. Cut off from both self-knowledge and divine comfort, weighed under the currents of her grief. "My love lost, my hope quenched, my faith death struck, swayed full and mighty above me in one sullen mass. That bitter hour cannot be described." However, God does respond to Jane, both through Jane's renewed trust in her intuition and supernaturally. Jane receives her first answer as her conscience reasserts itself. "I wanted to be weak that I might avoid the awful passage of further suffering I saw laid out before me." And conscience, turned tyrant, held passion by the throat. Though she recognizes that leaving Thornfield will be unspeakably painful, she regains her conscience's clear sight and resolves to follow it. In this resolution, she overcomes the temptation to allow her desires to override her will and reason. Rejecting Rochester's offer to become his mistress, Jane reflects, "Not a human being that ever lived could wish to be better loved than I was loved by Rochester, and him who thus loved me I absolutely worshipped, and I must renounce love and idol." Rochester attempts to undermine Jane's resolve, But she stands firm, exhorting him to submit his will to the divine and thus correct his reason and desires. Do as I do. Trust in God and yourself. Believe in heaven, hope to meet there again. In her final expression of her conscience and will over her desires, Jane declares in my personal favorite lines of the book, I care for myself. I will keep the law given by God. I will hold to the principles received by me when I was sane and not mad, as I am now. Laws and principles are not for the times when there is no temptation. They are for such moments as this, when body and soul rise in mutiny against their rigor. Stringent are they, inviolate they shall be. If at my individual convenience I might break them, what would be their worth? They have a worth, so I have always believed. Preconceived opinions, foregone determinations, are all I have at this hour to stand by. There I plant my foot. Thormelin notes, Jane's words express a powerful commitment to her own integrity. Rochester acknowledges, consciously or not, that her yielding to him would have been a meaningless sacrifice. The resolute, wild, free spirit only manages to remain so thanks to Jane's retaining the integrity which gives her full mastery of it. By resisting her desire's idolatrous dictates, Jane saves her passionate nature from being corrupted by Rochester. Then, having exercised her will to reject Rochester's offers in the face of her own desires, Jane receives a supernatural affirmation of her conscience, a vision urging her to flee Thornfield. During her engagement, Jane hesitated to act on her dreams that warned of Rochester's deceit and coming disaster. This time, with her faith and her intuition restored, Jane doesn't waver. She immediately heeds the supernatural warning and leaves Thornfield with almost nothing, well aware that she may not survive her journey. Though she is physically endangered, Jane experiences spiritual restoration as soon as she trusts her intuition. We see affirmation of Jane's actions through her renewed ability to pray and to receive divine comfort. Sure was I of his efficiency to save what he had made. Convinced I grew that neither earth should perish nor one of the souls it treasured. I turned my prayer to thanksgiving. Mr. Rochester was safe, he was God's, and by God he would be guarded. We turn to the second temptation Jane faces in her next courtship. As Thormelin observes, the duty of individuals to themselves cannot be separated from their obligations to their fellow creatures. This tension serves as the key conflict in the final stage of Jane's spiritual development. Whereas Rochester tempted Jane's desires to overtake her will in relation to her reason, St. John tempts Jane's reason to overtake her will in relation to her desires. On the surface, St. John appears to be the ideal mate for Jane. His introduction into the story is as her savior, rescuing her from sure death. Through him, Jane receives physical security in the form of a home and occupation, emotional security in the form of her affectionate cousins, and financial security in the form of her inheritance. Jane repeatedly affirms his good character, and he is devoid of the obvious moral failings that characterize Rochester's profligate ways. He's got like a -10 on sex appeal, but after her ordeal with Rochester, that kind of works for where Jane is at in her life. However, St. John's characterization subtly indicates that he is no divinely appointed partner for Jane. St. John's primary sin is a lack of love. Though he wants to become a missionary, it is not because he feels love for the people of India. And guys, we could get into a whole thing about colonialism and mission work, but that is another conversation outside the bounds of this analysis. For the purposes of this conversation, let's grant that being a missionary is meant to be a proxy for having a noble spiritual calling, at least in the text. Rather, it is the appeal to his talents and powers that moves St. John to undertake his missionary work. This affirmation of his ego over his heart, reason and not feeling is my guide, exposes his misplaced priorities on two scores. First, as Thormelin argues, anyone who claims special religious privilege or talent in Bronte's work is suspect, as she saw this kind of elitism as a form of hypocrisy. Second, in a religious context that prized the heart as the seat of religion, St. John's heartless religion is incompatible with the faith he seeks to propagate. St. John wants to improve Indian society through his civilizing influence. He is resistant, however, to fostering love in his closest relationships, such as with his relatives and with his true beloved, Rosamond. Thormelin notes that he is the type of man who would always rather exert himself for a stranger rather than show consideration for his intimates. This failure of love is a damning one in Bronte's spiritual economy. Bronte's characterization of St. John indicates that he is far from the perfect picture of Christian character that his dour veneer might suggest. But that veneer threatens Jane's struggle to maintain her integrity. The temptation to allow her sense of duty to override her affections threatens her journey of spiritual development more than her idolatrous love of Rochester did. Thormelin argues the temptation of St. John is much more dangerous to that sense of her own worth, because St. John's onslaught on the spirit whose essential freedom Rochester loved comes in the guise of religion. By contrast, Rochester flouted God's law, as Jane instantly realized. His arguments were easy to resist. The essential threat to her was posed by his love and need of her. St. John, however, neither loves nor needs Jane in any personal sense. It is for God's service he claims her, telling her that by refusing him, she would reject God. Jane is genuinely tempted to succumb to St. John's projection of a divine plan for her life. I was tempted to cease struggling with him, to rush down the torrent of his will into the gulf of his existence, and there to lose my own. There is something in this resonant to the experience of most women in patriarchal societies, the temptation to yield your sense of self in favor of a man's dreams and ambitions. Jane must resist this temptation, however, because to give in would be to ignore her heart's dictates and true vocation. In Bronte's early Victorian context, to ignore either one's vocation or heart was spiritually dangerous. Early Victorians strongly connected the heart's demands to religion's demands. Thormelin explains, such a gift of her heart to St. John would, as Jane recognized, constitute the surrender of her whole self. We are reminded of the centrality of the heart in early 19th century theology. It is not merely the seat of feeling, it is the core of the entire personality, including its religious dimensions. Jane knows she must resist giving her heart to someone who cannot love her, as St. John plainly tells her he cannot. You were formed for labor, not for love. This violation of the heart would eventually kill Jane. She herself is aware of this and repeatedly tells St. John that his proposal would result in her death. However, St. John's charismatic persuasion nearly breaks her will. In the crucial moment, Jane is once again saved by supernatural means. As she is weakening to St. John's persuasion, she hears Rochester calling for her. This miracle is a divine affirmation of her will and the rightness of resisting St. John's admonitions. Reaffirmed by this spiritual intervention, Jane again flees temptation and holds to her earlier assertion. I will give my heart to God. You do not want it. Returning to Thornfield, she discovers that there is no longer any impediment between her affections and her conscience. Jane's reunion with Rochester foreshadows the fullness of their coming happiness. Now that her desire and reason are in accord, Jane is free to share her full self with her beloved. When the blinded Rochester asks if it is really Jane who stands before him, she answers, she is all here, her heart too. Her heart, the seat of both her person and her faith, can now be freely given to Rochester as they have both matured in their development. Throughout her trials, Jane has moved closer to integrated personhood, and this development frees her to love Rochester without idolatry. Rochester and Jane's happiness, however, is only assured because of Rochester's concurrent journey of redemption. His journey is a more straightforward one, so I won't go into as much detail on it, but it is a necessary component of the novel's happy ending. By loving Jane and allowing her love to convict and transform him, Rochester is saved from his broken reason and uncontrolled desires. Jane's role in Rochester's redemption is hinted at in their first meeting, where she helps him after his horse throws him, and again when she saves him from the bed fire that Bertha starts. The obvious resonances between salvation from a fire and salvation from hell's fire in that instance should be noted. In both cases, Rochester must lean on Jane for physical support, as he will emotionally and spiritually lean on her guidance in the months to come. Rochester's deficient will manifests itself from the moment he meets Jane. He confesses after the aborted wedding that he meant to be a bigamist from the moment that he saw her. Indeed, every interaction he has with Jane hints at his planned deception. Rochester believes absolutely in his own reason, and therefore does not doubt his self-knowledge. However, unlike Jane, this self-knowledge is not rooted in a will subjugated to the divine. Rather, it is driven by Rochester's own desires. Whereas Jane's prophetic qualities are proven repeatedly to be correct, even against all evidence to the contrary, Rochester's insights are ultimately proven to be blindly misguided at nearly every turn. For example, when he takes the guise of a fortune teller, he attempts to deceive Jane and plant the seeds of his warped reason into her mind, but Jane is ultimately not fooled by his disguise. Though Rochester makes a token nod to the dictates of conscience, his moral insight proves superficial at best. For Rochester, his morality is solely predicated on his flawed reasoning. I have formed my plans. Right plans, I deem them, and in them I have attended to the claims of conscience, the counsels of reason. Though he keeps assuring himself of his actions' rightness, Rochester's self-justifying soliloquies at pivotal moments betrays his subconscious awareness that what he's doing is wrong. During his proposal, he exclaims, "God pardon me, and man meddle not with me. I have her and will hold her." His language in justifying his action is replete with theological allusions. "It will atone. Have I not found her friendless, and cold, and comfortless? Will I not guard and cherish and solace her? Is there not love in my heart and constancy in my resolves? It will expiate at God's tribunal. I know my Maker sanctions what I do." But Rochester is only deceiving himself into thinking he can forge a man-made heaven in this life with Jane, and is thus blinded to how he has objectified her. He talks about her as his treasure and angel because she must be to fulfill his fantasy. She rebukes this idea, reminding him that she is no angel and has no desire to be outfitted like the courtesan that he is secretly making her. Rochester's awareness that he has sinned against Jane and God develops slowly. When his plans are discovered, he is genuinely contrite that his thwarted plans have hurt Jane, but still does not acknowledge that his plan itself was intrinsically hurtful to her. His analogy reveals that he understands the wound dealt to Jane, but not that he is the one responsible for dealing the blow. If the man who had but the little ewe lamb that was as dear to him as a daughter had by some mistake slaughtered it at the shambles, he would not have rued his bloody blunder more than I now rue mine. He then acknowledges that he was wrong to bring her to Thornfield with his wife residing there, but not that he was wrong to pursue her in the first place. He repeatedly attempts to coerce her with his warped perspective. "Jane, will you hear reason? Is it better to drive a fellow creature to despair than to transgress against a mere human law? No man being injured by the breach? For you have neither relative nor acquaintances who you need to fear to offend by living with me." Rochester's redemption comes in 3 parts. First, upon realizing that Jane has been driven to flee Thornfield without resources into the night, Rochester finally acknowledges that his plan to make her his mistress was inherently wrong because he knew Jane would never have agreed to his plan had she been aware of what was really happening. Second, he finally acts with basic humanity towards his wife. When Bertha sets fire to Thornfield, Rochester tries to save her life and loses his sight and one hand in the effort, perhaps in an allusion to a Christian parable about how to avoid temptation. This provides symbolic atonement as his actions at last demonstrate care for the mentally unwell person who he has seen up until now as a barrier to his own desires. Third, he subjugates his will to God. Through prayer and contrition, Rochester experiences sanctification as he affirms his unrequited love for Jane, but accepts divine will above his own desires. After this transformation in Rochester's life, he's finally free to experience true happiness with Jane. He no longer sees Jane as his right or as a self-made heaven, but as a divine blessing who has her own integrity as a person. Rather than coercing her to stay with him, he now knows that she will stay of her own will, and he is delighted when she chooses to stay with him. His jealousy of St. John reveals that he no longer takes Jane for granted. She has other options, and believing her love is now engaged elsewhere, he urges her to marry St. John. He puts her happiness before his, mourning that he is no longer a suitable partner for her in his own eyes. "I am no better than the old lightning-struck tree in Thornfield orchard, and what right would that ruin have to bid a budding woodbine cover its decay with its freshness?" At their reunion, Rochester testifies to his path of redemption. He acknowledges that he not only hurt Jane, but also wronged both her and God. "My heart swells with gratitude at the beneficent God of this earth just now. He sees not as man sees, but far clearer. I did wrong. I would have sullied my innocent flower. The Omnipotent snatched it from me. I, in my sniff-necked rebellion, almost cursed the dispensation. Instead of bending to the decree, I defied it. I was forced to pass through the valley of the shadow of death. Of late, Jane, only of late, I begin to see and acknowledge the hand of God in my doom. I began to experience remorse, repentance, the wish for reconcilement with my Maker." Because he has been physically humbled, Rochester is forced to depend on Jane. He is no longer afraid of this mutuality, however, and he sees Jane as a gift. His response of gratitude for her reflects his understanding that with the gift of love comes responsibility to honor that love with his actions. Now I thank God that in the midst of judgment he has remembered mercy. I humbly entreat my Redeemer to give me strength to lead henceforth a purer life than I have done hitherto. In Rochester's journey of redemption, Jane serves both as Rochester's inspiration to change and as a living embodiment of God's mercy towards him. Rochester is blinded because of his own ongoing mistreatment towards Bertha. However, Jane's reappearance marks the light of forgiveness entering his life. Through her eyes, he learns to see again in his ongoing transformation, first figuratively and then literally. Rochester has repented and literally undergoes purification through fire, sacrificing his sight and independence to try to finally do right by the person who he has treated with cruelty. In this repentant state, he can now receive a true partner through whom he has received both spiritual and social redemption. The character arcs of both Jane and Rochester reflect the spiritual concerns of their creator, but this is not the full extent to which the novel can be read through a religious paradigm. There are so many spiritual themes, allusions, and motifs that we could explore with Jane Eyre. Bronte's work has a higher density of biblical allusions than any of her contemporaries. I mention these other possible theological or philosophical readings of the text to underline that I don't think that my reading of the spiritual journeys of the main characters of Jane Eyre is incidental. I think that whether it was entirely constructed consciously by Charlotte Bronte, some of her personal spirituality infused the underlying foundation of the text that she created. It is that structure that I believe holds the narrative together in a much more purposeful fashion than many of her critics give the book credit for. So, to start to land this plane, I hope I've accomplished a few things in this video. First, I discussed the widespread feeling that Jane Eyre's ending is lackluster, inadequate, or a cop to the novel's feminist message, basically an afterthought patched on to appease its contemporary saccharine sensibilities. Second, I've set the table as to why I'm including certain analytical tools in my interpretation of Jane Eyre's narrative structure, diving into the intent versus impact of an artistic work on communities it represents, as well as the spectrum of literary interpretation between death of the author and authorial intent as king. I know I may be disappointing folks on all sides of this argument with my perspective, but I hope I at least provided food for thought or insight into how I approach these matters. Third, I argued in favor of the artistic integrity of Jane Eyre's ending on two scores, one focusing on narrative structure and the other focusing on character development. To the former, I believe Jane Eyre's plot is far more cohesive as a whole when you see it as a romance novel's narrative structure as laid out by Pamela Regis. To the latter, I argue that by layering Charlotte Bronte's own religious beliefs onto Jane and Rochester's character journeys, the ending of those character arcs makes far more sense and feels more like the logical payoff of how they have been growing over the course of the book. Even if you leave the book not liking Rochester, which, honestly, fair, I hope that maybe I've illuminated why some of us leave the book rooting for their romance, despite his flaws.
Welcome to Mr. Darcy is a Dom, Episode 1. Today I'd like to start by clarifying that Mr. Darcy is a soft Dom, which is quite different than our trick you into bigamy and threaten to strangle you hard Dom, Mr. Rochester.
I've talked a lot about religion and specifically Christianity in this video, so I do just want to mention that I don't think you have to believe in any of Bronte's underlying theology to enjoy the character arc in Jane Eyre, or even pick up on some of these elements of why they appeal to you. I offer these thoughts as a way to deepen our appreciation for Bronte's craftsmanship, not as an argument or apologetics for any specific dogma. Part of what keeps this book's spiritual elements from becoming some kind of parable or morality play is that rather than reinforcing dogma, the novel takes Jane's own interiority seriously. She experiences real existential doubt and wrestles with questions of faith and morality throughout the work. Her problems are not resolved through simplistic piety. Every moral victory she experiences has profound material and psychic cost. Jane's faith is not shown as something that exists in either a vacuum or an idealized Christendom. Rather, Bronte unflinchingly examines Jane's faith in the context of profoundly unjust relationships within her family, her religion, and her larger society. Jane grows as a person in the face of genuine obstacles, and Bronte's depiction of Jane is never simplistic. So I hope no one walks away thinking of Jane Eyre as some kind of dreary sermon that has thinly drawn caricatures acting out its main points. I'm just trying to point out that bringing in some of Bronte's personal philosophy enriches my personal appreciation for an already excellent piece of art. And so, that's my perspective on why Jane Eyre's ending is amazing. Definitely let me know what you think in the comments below. Part of the beauty of art is that many people can see things many different ways, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on why the ending does or doesn't work in your opinion. Hope you guys enjoyed another video essay from me, and me trying something a little bit different with the visuals. Have a great day, and I will just talk to you guys soon. Bye!